Lando Norris wins in Monaco. His first career win in the Principality and a much needed win for his championship hopes this season. It was almost a Ferrari pole with Charles Leclerc, but why is Ferrari still not happy with a P2 and P5 finish? And it looks like the two-stop rule change didn't fix Monaco. Where does the FIA go from here, and why is it probably unlikely this rule returns next year? We've got a lot to talk about, but it's all coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. Well, you still can't overtake around here. The rules didn't change that, but they did at least give us an eventful weekend in Monaco. Before we get to Sunday's race, I want to touch on a few things we saw from qualifying on Saturday. As it is in Monaco, even with the new rules, qualifying means everything, which still makes it easily the most exciting Saturday of the year, and we got that again this year. You could tell this was going to be close the moment the first practice session started, and we saw how fast Ferraris were compared to the McLarens and Max Verstappen's Red Bull. And for a while, it looked like we were going to get Charles Leclerc back on pole for his home race yet again. But credit to Lando Norris. He got it right just in time, and his final Q3 run was out of this world, setting a lap record and just absolutely breaking the hearts of the home crowd. And the McLaren pit wall got it right too. So with about 4 minutes left in Q3, they send Lando and Oscar out for their final runs, which in the moment seemed a little bit early. Everyone else was waiting to time it so their drivers could only get one lap in at the last minute, but their tires would ideally be in the perfect situation and not being too burned up from that second run. But McLaren's approach ended up being the right one. Not only did both drivers get in a banker lap without any traffic bothering them, but that banker lap gave them a cushion. It took some of that pressure off for their final run. If McLaren waits and goes out with everyone else, I think we see Leclerc on pole instead, not Lando. But Lando desperately needed this one. This weekend as a whole was big for him moving forward this year, but everything started with qualifying. It's obvious watching on TV. This is hands down the most difficult track. So to get pole here, where the pressure's so high and the corners are so tight, it tells me a lot about Lando's state of mind and his growth over these past few months as he's been dealing with all of these issues. The car's been there for him. The talent's been there too. But for whatever reason, he just kept having these lapses in judgment and these dips in confidence that just kept leading to all of these qualifying mistakes, which then of course carried over into the race on Sundays. So to get back on pole here with a lap like that tells me Lando's back where he needs to be from a mental standpoint. After qualifying, Charles Leclerc looked pretty disappointed, obviously because he knew it probably meant he lost the race on Sunday with that result, but it was still a result Ferrari should be proud of. They've been nowhere in qualifying this year. And granted, this track is very unique and ended up suiting their car quite nicely, so this type of result likely won't carry over to many other tracks, but it's still a step in the right direction for the team. It was something they definitely did not expect coming into this weekend. I want to give some flowers to a few others who qualified in the top 10. Isaac Hadjar qualified P6, Fernando Alonso qualified P7. Of course, both of these drivers end up getting pushed up a position because of the Lewis Hamilton impeding penalty. Esteban Ocon qualifies P8 and Liam Lawson qualifies P9. Really impressive stuff from all four drivers. Of course, for Fernando, it didn't translate to a good race result because of the mechanical problems that he dealt with during the race, which we'll get to in the podcast a little later on. But for everyone else, this is what won them points on Sunday. Invaluable points at that for these midfield teams. On the other hand, it was a really tough qualifying for Mercedes and one that just ruined their weekend. At the end of Q3, Kimi was out on his final run, came out of the tunnel, down the hill, into the Nouvelle chicane, clips the barrier, breaks his suspension, qualifying over. It's a mistake we have seen so many times here, and a really easy mistake to make, but it's a mistake that costs you so much when it happens in qualifying. Because of an earlier time, Kimi still made it into Q2, but started 15th in the race because he was out at that point. He's not setting any times in Q2. But it didn't just rain on Mercedes on Saturday. It poured. So all of this happens with Kimi. Q2 starts, and before we know it, George is going slowly on track. He comes to a stop. He's got a mechanical failure, and he's out before he can even set a time, which puts him at 14th for the start of the race. At this point, it's essentially game over for Mercedes. When you're starting that far back in Monaco, there's very little hope for Sunday. If you don't get some safety car chaos or red flag that comes out at the right time, there's just not really anything you can do to save that. A really tough break for Mercedes, because if they qualified where they should have, they easily would have been in the points on Sunday. Let's talk about Sunday, though. Lando Norris converts the pole to a race win and now closes the gap to his teammate in the Drivers' Championship to 3 points. Charles Leclerc finishes P2, Oscar Piastri P3 to round off the podium. We've got a lot to dive into with the race, but I want to start with Lando. I mentioned it a second ago with the qualifying recap, but this was a huge weekend for him. It seems like an easy job to take home the win here if you come out of turn 1 in the lead on the first lap, but this one wasn't that easy. With the new pit stop rule, no one really knew what to expect with strategy, and being the leader did put him at a disadvantage with the risk of Leclerc diving into the pits first and undercutting him for the lead. The McLaren pit wall got it right, though, bringing him in first for that first pit stop on lap 19 and just completely taking that risk of an undercut away. And to Lando's credit, he built a big enough lead over Leclerc over the second stint where they were able to just react to Leclerc's second pit stop without risking anything. But those final 10 to 15 laps, when Lando was right behind Max and had Charles closing in behind him, there's a lot of pressure in that moment. And it's so easy to lose concentration just for a brief little second, clip one of the barriers or lock up. And in a moment like that, it can cost you the race. So yeah, of course Leclerc couldn't get past Lando unless Lando had a mishap like that. But Lando handled the pressure and drove the car perfectly in the final stage. I think we're going to see a few more swings of momentum in the championship fight, but for now, it feels like the momentum swung back in Lando's favor. And you can really point back to Miami as to when things started to change. Of course, Oscar won in Miami, but if Lando doesn't go off track in that lap 1 incident with Max, he's probably winning that race. We go to Imola, and there were other factors that came into play with the McLaren strategy calls and Oscar's own mistakes, but Lando ultimately finishes ahead of Oscar. And now we have this weekend, where Lando looked like the strongest out of the two in the practice sessions. He out-qualifies Oscar. He takes home the race win. A few weeks ago, it looked like Oscar could really start to run away with the championship. Not anymore. This will be a very important summer for the two Papaya drivers, but this Drivers' Championship is up for grabs. A pretty decent result for Ferrari, but they still don't seem too happy about it. P2 for Charles Leclerc, P5 for Lewis Hamilton. Both drivers, though, seemed pretty disappointed after the race. For Leclerc, I think it really all came down to qualifying and him just realizing how close he was to winning this race, and to essentially be a tenth of a second away from that in qualifying. That's something that's going to sting. For Lewis, I think some of the qualifying disappointments still carried over into the race too, and you get it. That 3-place grid penalty he received for impeding really hurts at a track like this. But it was also another race where he just struggled a lot more than expected. Despite finishing 5th, Lewis was still 51 seconds off the lead and 48 seconds behind his teammate. It got really weird for him in the second half of the race. His pace was just dropping off significantly, almost similar to what we were seeing from the Racing Bulls and Williams cars that were intentionally trying to go slow for the benefit of their teammate. Except Lewis had no one around him to hold up, and Charles was way ahead anyways. He was just slow. And maybe he realized there was no reason to push and his result would have been the same regardless, but you never know how the race is going to unfold, and there's a chance Lewis could have gotten up to P4 with Max holding out for that late pit stop. It's just starting to get that point with Lewis where he just might not have it anymore. You knew there were going to be struggles coming into a new team, but you'd think he'd have some of these things figured out by now. Leclerc has the head-to-head advantage over him, 7-1 in qualifying and 6-1 in races. The team's never going to admit it and put a label on it, but Lewis is Ferrari's number 2 driver, and he looks nowhere close to Leclerc. A few quick thoughts on Max. Pretty uneventful race for him, even though he led the race at a few points. It didn't end up working for them, but Red Bull made the right strategy calls, keeping Max out long for the first and second stints. In both situations, when Max was in the lead, if they got a safety car or a red flag, that changes everything and likely gives Max the win. And Max didn't lose any positions taking those chances, so it's a very high reward, no risk situation. And you really can't fault Red Bull for making that strategy call. All right, it's time. Let's talk about these new pit stop rules and all of the chaos we saw with it. I don't think we're going to see these rules after this year. They really brought out the ugly side of Monaco, with drivers intentionally holding up the pack behind them for their teammate ahead. It all started with Racing Bulls. Liam Lawson started pulling back on lap 7 to build a gap for Isaac Hadjar to pit into, who was ahead of him at the time. Liam was literally losing 2, 3, 4 seconds a lap. By lap 14, only lap 14, there was a 21-second gap between Hadjar and Lawson. Hadjar comes in, puts on soft tires, comes out ahead of Lawson, and then Racing Bull says, all right, let's do it again. Go for another round. Has Lawson slow down again, so Hadjar could pull out another gap. And then only 6 laps later, on lap 20, Hadjar comes in for his second stop, and the gap to Lawson is already 20 seconds again. But then Williams, who's directly behind the Racing Bulls, watching all of this happen, probably thinking, all right, we've got to do something to cover this off. They join the party. So on lap 26, Carlos Sainz backs the field up to give Alex Albon ahead of him a gap to pit into. By lap 32, when Albon comes in for his first stop, the gap to Sainz is already 20 seconds. Albon comes out of the pits just ahead of Sainz, and like the Racing Bulls, they do it all over again. Albon makes his second stop on lap 41, and in those 9 laps, Sainz drops back another 20 seconds from Albon. And then the two Williams swap positions on lap 43 and do it all over again for Sainz's benefit. By the time Sainz pits 5 laps later, he's 20 seconds ahead of Albon, and it only takes another 6 more laps for Albon to drop back another 20 seconds, and Sainz comes in to make his second pit stop. For Racing Bulls and Williams, though, I don't blame them for doing it. The rules in this track open the door for that type of situation to be exploited. And for two midfield teams who are in a tight battle with each other and fighting for points that don't come around too often, it's their job to maximize their results to the best of their abilities, and that's what they did. From a surface level, it didn't look good for the sport, though. Formula One is the highest level of racing, and Monaco is one of the most notable races on the calendar. You tune in, you expect to see drivers pushing these cars to the absolute limit around these tight barriers. But instead, you have drivers intentionally pushing their cars 60%, 70%, if that. But at the same time, we do see drivers trying to hold up cars behind them for the benefit of their teammate all of the time at plenty of other circuits. I think the difference with today is the two-stop format just made it a little more obvious and deliberate, and the track made it look even worse too. If you get stuck behind a car trying to hold you up at any other track, you might be stuck behind them for a few laps, but eventually, if you have the pace, you can get around them and go on your way. Here it's different. You can't overtake, and if you're a car stuck behind, there's literally nothing you can do about it. But I think another thing to consider is this type of race manipulation is possible with a one-stop race too. It's just not exclusive to the two-stop format. So where does the FIA go from here? What's the fix? I think the two-stop format will be gone just because of the criticism this race has and will receive, but personally, I think that might be a mistake. Turning it back into a one-stop race is not going to solve this problem with cars holding each other up. And then we open ourselves up to what happened last year when you get an early red flag and don't get any actual pit stops during the race. My own idea, and I don't know if this is even possible, but what if we put a sensor on each car that monitors how much a car is pushing? You look back at the data from previous years and you determine how hard you can push around here without compromising your tires. And then you set a threshold based on that data and say, okay, if we catch you pushing less than 70% or 80% or whatever number that would be, you get some sort of penalty, but a penalty harsh enough like a drive-through or grid drop in the next race that would be strong enough to deter this type of racing. The two-stop would have to stay for this to work because you would need to make sure that it's not a situation like 2024 where drivers are trying to make it 70-plus laps on one tire. It could be a very gimmicky rule on top of gimmicky rules that already exist, but it could be something that actually stops this kind of racing from happening. But I think the best fix is really a change to the fans' perspective for this race. It's always been hard to pass in Monaco, and it always will be. And that's something that spanned over many regulations and many different versions of Formula One cars. We can't take this race off the calendar. It's too prestigious and it's too much of a staple for the sport. So maybe instead, we just need to accept this weekend for what it is, even if it means the race winner is usually decided in qualifying. It's part of Monaco, and it's what makes this track and this weekend so unique. Sure, the Sundays might not be so great, but on the flip side, we get the most exciting Saturday of the season, and there's something special about that. And you can tell winning this race still means so much to drivers, and it's a win that will stick out for them for the rest of their lives. So maybe it's time for us to just accept this race for what it is and stop trying to change things and make it what we want it to be. A few other quick thoughts on some of the other teams. As expected, pretty bad race for Mercedes. George Russell finishes P11 2 laps down, and Kimi Antonelli finishes P18 3 laps down. But realistically, all of this came down to qualifying. If they qualified where they should have, this would have been a much different result on Sunday. Starting 14th and 15th, but more importantly, being stuck behind the Racing Bulls and Williams while they slowed everyone down just killed Mercedes. There was nothing they could have done to avoid that situation either. The Sky commentators kept calling out their strategy during the race, saying, "Oh, why doesn't Mercedes pit? What are they doing?" But realistically, it wouldn't have mattered. Say they caught on to the Racing Bulls and brought one or both of their drivers in for a stop, maybe even 2 stops. They still would have been caught behind the Racing Bulls and Williams while they slowed everyone down so they could get their pit stops in. The only thing that could have saved Mercedes today was a perfectly timed safety car or red flag, and unfortunately for them, it just never came. I actually like the penalty the stewards gave George Russell for cutting the chicane to get past Albon. He probably hurt himself more with his radio messages, but you can't allow drivers to pull a move like that with no remorse. And a 5 or 10-second penalty wouldn't have made a difference like the drive-through did. So, overall, good call from the stewards on that one. Tough day for Alpine. Lap 8, Pierre Gasly runs into the back of Yuki Tsunoda, just ending his race right there. 100% blame for this falls on Gasly. It looked like he got a little loose coming out of the tunnel, and that caused him to lock up the brakes, but nothing Yuki could have done there to avoid that from happening. But also, a really heads-up move by Gasly's teammate Franco Colapinto, avoiding a second collision with Gasly, as Gasly went through the chicane after the collision out of control. For Colapinto, though, he ends up finishing P13, which isn't a bad result for Monaco considering he started 18th, but overall, nothing to really take away from this race for Alpine. Tough break for Fernando Alonso with his engine failure. He retires on lap 38 and was running 6th at the time. He was without a doubt headed for his first points finish of the season. The Aston Martin hasn't been great this year, and there have been opportunities for Alonso, but it just seems like every time one of those opportunities comes, so does the bad luck. It's turning out to be a long season for Alonso, and also one of his worst seasons too. The only other time he went scoreless through the first 8 races, his rookie season in 2001. There should be other opportunities for points, but missing out on this one is really going to hurt for Fernando. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode recapping the Monaco Grand Prix weekend. Big win for Lando. Big weekend for McLaren too, getting some more points in the constructors fight and just extending that lead, and they really have a stranglehold on that championship battle now. And they might need that lead because next weekend we are headed off to Spain where the Flexi Wing technical directives begin. There's a chance a lot could change starting next weekend. I will, of course, be back with a preview episode for the Spanish Grand Prix later in the week, and I'll go more in depth about those new regulation changes and what they should mean for all of these teams. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.